Chapter 15, Section 3, Americans Call for a War with Spain. In 1897, the Spanish government promised greater self-rule in Cuba. It also removed General Vilar from his post and ordered him to return to Spain. As a result, the Cuban crisis cooled down. In February 1898, however, two events aroused American anger and led to increasing calls for war. The Delhomme letter incites the public. On February 9, 1898, Hearst's New York Journal published a letter written by Enrique Después Delhomme, the Spanish ambassador to Washington. The Delhomme letter was addressed to a friend in Cuba, but was somehow stolen from the mail and sent to the Journal for publication. In the letter, Delhomme called President McKinley weak and catering to the rabble, and besides, a low politician. Americans were offended by this criticism and their president. Delhomme offered his resignation, but the damage was done. The publishing of this letter intensified anti-Spanish feelings in the United States and underscored the power of the press to inflame public opinion. Newspapers decry the Maine incident. Not long after the Delhomme letter, a much more alarming incident occurred, the sinking of the battleship USS Maine in Havana Harbor. Newspapers around the countryside responded with calls for vengeance. The Maine had sailed to Cuba in January after riots broke out in the streets of Havana. Spaniards who opposed government reforms in Cuba led the riots. Fearing harm to the American citizens and property, President McKinley had sent the Maine to Cuba to protect American interests. For 2 weeks, the Maine sat in Havana Harbor. Then, on the night of February 15th, a tremendous explosion rocked the battleship. The captain reported hearing a bursting, rending, and crashing roar of immense volume. Then the ship began to sink. More than 260 sailors died from the blast. An official Navy investigation began immediately, but the Journal and other newspapers immediately blamed Spain. The Hearst paper published bellicose articles under such headlines as, "The Maine was destroyed by treachery," and "The whole country thrills with war fever." Across the country, "Remember the Maine" became a rallying cry for war. The United States responds. In March, the Navy issued its report on the sinking of the Maine. Though the evidence was sketchy, Navy investigators concluded that the explosion was caused by an underwater mine. The report did not suggest who was responsible. In 1976, Navy researchers who studied the incident again concluded that heat from a fire in a coal bin exploded a nearby supply of ammunition. 4 days before the report was completed, Senator Redfield, Proctor of Vermont, gave a compelling speech on the Senate floor. Proctor had just returned from Cuba and described the appalling conditions there. Although General Vilar was no longer in charge, the reconcentration camps were still in operation, and the Cuban people were still suffering. Proctor concluded, "To me, the strongest appeal is not the barbarity practiced by Vilar or the loss of the Maine, but the spectacle of 1.5 million people, the entire native population of Cuba, struggling for freedom and deliverance from the worst misgovernment of which I have ever had knowledge." Redfield Proctor, speech before the Senate, March 17, 1898. The Maine report and Proctor's speech helped turn opinion in Congress and the public toward war. But President McKinley, still hoping to avoid conflict, gave Spain one last chance. He called for an armistice, a cessation of hostilities until a permanent peace could be discussed. He also called on Spain to close the reconcentration camps and to take steps to grant Cuba its independence. Spain agreed to an armistice and to closing the camps, but was unwilling to give up control of Cuba. Under great public pressure, McKinley asked Congress to declare war on Spain. Congress passed a resolution, a formal statement about a course of action, recognizing Cuban independence and authorizing military force, if necessary, to liberate Cuba. Congress also passed the Teller Amendment, which said that after Cuba was liberated and peace was restored, the United States would leave the government and control of the island to its people. Spain then passed a declaration of war against the United States. On April 25th, Congress formally declared war on Spain.